It was a chilly winter afternoon in downtown Manhattan, the kind of cold that made you pull your collar up and bury your hands deep in your pockets. The city was alive, as always, buzzing with its signature mix of ambition, chaos, and indifference. The streets were crowded with hurried commuters, tourists snapping pictures and vendors hawking hot dogs and pretzels. But there was one man who stood out, not for his clothes or the obvious dishevelment of his life, but for the look of quiet determination in his eyes. His name was John, though the people who passed him by on the streets rarely bothered to ask. John was homeless, but he wasn't just any homeless man. No, he had a story, one filled with dreams, misfortunes, and a desperation that had shaped him into something more than just a forgotten face in the crowd. On this particular day, he found himself sitting on the cold, gray sidewalk of Fifth Avenue, with a small sign that read simply, "Need $1. Please help." His hands were wrapped tightly around a half-empty cup, the change inside clinking softly with every slight movement. His eyes scanned the passing throng, looking for the next soul to approach. But it wasn't just anyone he was hoping would stop. No, there was someone specific. Barron Trump, the son of former President Donald Trump, was in town for the weekend. He had just finished up an afternoon at a nearby art gallery and was walking along the street with his bodyguard in tow. Barron was 19 now, tall, with an air of quiet intelligence that was almost unnerving for someone his age. His eyes, though, seemed more attuned to the city's pulse than most people his age, as if he could feel the struggles of the world around him. But today, like so many others, Barron's focus was on getting from point A to point B without letting the chaos of the city distract him. John noticed Barron almost immediately, standing out among the crowd of people, his height and presence unmistakable. Something about the way Barron walked, calmly, confidently, yet seemingly detached from the masses, pulled at John's attention. He'd seen enough faces in his life, enough hurried steps and fleeting glances, but Barron had something different about him. It wasn't just that he was wealthy, or that he carried an aura of privilege that John could only dream of. It was something deeper, something that made John think, maybe this one will help. The wind picked up, and John's fingers began to numb as he gripped the cup tighter. His eyes lingered on Barron, watching as the young man neared. He could hear the distant rumble of cars and the buzz of voices, but his focus was entirely on Barron. Just $1, he thought. That's all it would take to change my day, to change my life. Barron walked past John, but something made him stop. A strange pull in his chest, a hesitation that seemed foreign to someone who was used to walking through the city without a second thought. It was as if the universe itself had whispered to him, telling him to turn around. John saw the moment Barron stopped. He didn't know why Barron had paused, but it was all the opening he needed. In a soft, rasping voice, John spoke, "Hey, kid, got $1?" Barron turned slowly, his bodyguard a few steps behind him. For a brief moment, their eyes locked. John saw the flicker of surprise in Barron's gaze, a mixture of confusion, hesitation, and something else, something that wasn't immediately clear. Barron didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, observing John for a moment that felt like an eternity. John didn't break eye contact. "I'm not asking for much, just $1. It could make all the difference." The city seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. The sounds of the bustling crowd faded into the background, and the two of them stood there, suspended in a moment of time that felt too important to rush. What happened next would change everything, not just for John, but for Barron too. Barron's mind raced. He wasn't used to being approached like this, not directly, not by someone who looked like John. His father had taught him many lessons over the years, most of them focused on business, success, and survival in a world that often left people like John behind. But now, as he stood there, staring down at the man who was asking for something so small, something so easily given, Barron felt the weight of a decision forming in his gut. He could just walk away, as he had done countless times before with people asking for money. It was the safe choice, the expected one. But there was something about John's eyes, something raw and vulnerable, that made Barron stop. And then, without a word, Barron reached into his pocket. Barron Trump's hand hovered in his pocket, the cold fabric of his coat brushing against his fingertips as he searched for his wallet. But it wasn't just the chill in the air that froze him in place. It was something deeper, a sense of unfamiliarity that gnawed at his gut. He had been trained to give money to causes, to attend charity galas, to make the right donations to the right people. But this was different. John wasn't asking for a handout from a foundation or for a tax-deductible contribution. John was asking him, person to person. Barron glanced at his bodyguard, a quiet man named Richard, who had stepped back and was now scanning the crowd, eyes narrowed, alert as always. Richard's role was to keep Barron safe, to ensure he wasn't disturbed by the less savory aspects of the world. He'd seen it all. Homeless people asking for money, beggars with elaborate tales, panhandlers with grand performances. But John, there was something about him that made Richard's instincts tighten. He didn't trust the situation. Not one bit. "Barron, we should keep moving," Richard said, his voice low and steady. Barron didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on John, who sat there waiting, patient but worn, his hand still holding the cup. It was just $1. Just $1. He could hear his father's voice in his mind, the lessons drilled into him since he was a boy. "You can't fix the world, Barron. Help a little, yes, but don't get tangled in it. Don't let it distract you from what really matters." But Barron wasn't sure if he believed that anymore. He glanced back at John, meeting the man's tired, hopeful gaze. There was something in the way John looked at him, vulnerable yet proud, resigned yet still fighting. It was a look Barron had seen in the mirror too many times. The weight of expectation, the quiet desperation of wanting something more, but never quite knowing how to reach for it. Just $1. Barron pulled his wallet from his pocket and removed a single bill, the crumpled, worn edges speaking to the many hands it had passed through before landing in his. He stepped forward, holding the bill out to John. John's eyes lit up for a brief moment, but he didn't immediately take the money. "No," John said, his voice rough. "It's not the dollar I'm asking for, kid." Barron froze. He was caught between a question and an uncomfortable truth. Richard stepped closer, his presence more imposing now, a silent warning. Barron had to make a choice, but the words John had spoken, "It's not the dollar," had pierced through him in a way he couldn't quite explain. "What do you mean?" Barron asked, his voice quiet but filled with an edge of confusion. John's hand remained around the cup, but his eyes never left Barron's. "I've had enough of people throwing money at me," he said. "It's not the dollar that's going to change anything. You think a dollar's going to fix my life. That's just an excuse to keep walking. You're not going to change anything for me, kid." Barron's chest tightened. He wasn't prepared for this. He didn't know what to say. People didn't speak to him like this. They didn't ask him to do something real. And yet here was a man who, in the face of everything Barron thought he knew, was challenging him to see beyond the surface. John didn't wait for a response. "I don't need your pity. I need you to see me. I need you to understand that I've been on these streets longer than you've been alive. And I need you to care, really care, about what happens after you walk away. Not just give me $1 to feel better. You want to help. Do something that matters." Barron felt something shift inside him, a slow burn of frustration, confusion, and anger. He'd been sheltered from this. He knew about poverty, about inequality, about homelessness, but from a distance, an abstract, sanitized version of reality that never demanded more than a passing thought. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. What was he supposed to say? What could he do? As if on cue, Richard stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Barron, let's go. This is a distraction." But Barron didn't move. Instead, he locked eyes with John, his hand still holding the crumpled dollar, And for the first time in a long while, Barron felt something he hadn't expected: doubt. John didn't look away. "You're not really listening, are you? Go ahead. Take your dollar and keep walking. But you'll never understand." The words hit Barron hard. His bodyguard was already pulling on his sleeve, urging him to move, but something inside Barron resisted. He wanted to understand. He wanted to know what had driven John to this point, why someone like him was so quick to reject the very thing Barron had been taught was the solution. "I'm sorry," Barron muttered, his voice barely a whisper, almost to himself. "I don't know how to fix this." John's face softened for a moment, an almost imperceptible shift, as if he saw the struggle behind Barron's eyes. It didn't change anything, but it made Barron feel something, perhaps the beginning of an understanding, or at least the recognition that the world was far more complex than he'd ever realized. Before Barron could say anything else, Richard placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "We need to go. Now." Reluctantly, Barron withdrew the dollar and placed it into John's cup, his gesture hollow, almost mechanical. It didn't feel like enough. It never would. John took the dollar, his gaze flickering between Barron and the bodyguard. "You don't get it, but I'll take it anyway." Barron turned away, but his legs felt heavier than they had moments before. The city felt different now. The people around him, the sound of footsteps and horns and voices, it all seemed distant, out of reach. The moment had passed, but the question lingered in his mind. Was that really all he could do? The wind howled as Barron walked away from John, the weight of the encounter hanging over him like a cloud that wouldn't dissipate. He followed Richard through the bustling streets, his footsteps mechanical, as if he were walking on autopilot. The sound of his shoes on the pavement was muffled by the pounding in his chest. He could still hear John's words echoing in his ears. "You'll never understand. You don't get it." Barron's mind raced, but he couldn't find a way to quiet the gnawing doubt. What had just happened? It had been more than a simple exchange of money. He could sense that much, but the question was what exactly he was supposed to do with it. His father's voice tried to creep back in, reminding him of what was important: the legacy, the brand, the family. But something inside Barron was beginning to rebel against that, something that said there had to be more to life than just playing the game. And John, in that brief, charged moment, had made Barron feel like he was missing the point entirely. Richard, sensing Barron's discomfort, glanced sideways at him. "You all right, Barron?" His voice was low, concerned but guarded, as though he didn't expect an answer. It was his job to protect Barron from the distractions of the world, and it wasn't the first time he'd seen the young man caught in thought. But this felt different. Richard could see it in Barron's face. He was struggling with something deeper than usual. "I don't know," Barron replied quietly. His gaze was fixed ahead, but he wasn't really looking at anything. "What do you think, Richard? Is it enough to just give money? Does it ever really change anything?" Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the question. "You're talking about a homeless man on the street, Barron. You did what you could. It's a tough world out there. You can't save everyone." Barron's jaw tightened as he pushed through the crowd, not listening to Richard's words. It's a tough world. He knew that already, but he couldn't shake the feeling that John had seen something in him, something Barron had ignored or never even thought to question. For the first time, Barron wondered if he'd been too protected, too shielded from the harshness of the world outside the confines of his family's wealth. His thoughts were interrupted as his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his mother. "We need to talk. I have a meeting with the board tomorrow. Are you ready?" Barron's stomach twisted. Another meeting, another conversation about the future, another step in the direction of expectations he wasn't sure he wanted to follow. The pressure of it all had been mounting for years. Everyone around him had a plan, a path laid out for him to follow. He knew the game: attend the right events, make the right moves, and eventually take over the family business. But it was a script that no longer felt like his own. The more he thought about it, the more it felt suffocating, like a trap he was too afraid to escape. Richard noticed Barron's furrowed brow and gave him a quick look. "You need to focus. The meeting with your mother is important. The board's already going to be expecting your input, and we can't afford any distractions." But Barron was already too far gone in his own head. The words distractions and input bounced around in his mind, but they didn't seem to fit with what he'd just felt when he looked at John. That man had been in the thick of real struggle, real hardship, and yet somehow he had still managed to speak to Barron in a way no one else ever had. John had challenged him, forced him to see beyond the sterile expectations of his family and the life they had planned for him. It was a wake-up call, and Barron couldn't silence the urge to follow it, even if it led him somewhere dangerous. As they walked toward the car, Barron's phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a message. It was a news notification. He glanced at it without thinking, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the headline. "Man found dead in alley after apparent overdose." Witnesses reported a youthful encounter with wealthy figure earlier in the day. The article went on to describe the discovery of a man's body in an alley not far from where Barron had met John. Witnesses reported seeing the man earlier that day, asking for money, interacting with someone who appeared to be Barron Trump. Barron's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know if he should be relieved or horrified, but his mind immediately went to the conversation he'd had with John. Was it possible that this man, this homeless soul, had ended his life shortly after their exchange? Had Barron's gesture of $1 somehow been too little, too late? Richard's voice broke through Barron's thoughts. "You okay?" he asked again, more firmly this time, as Barron stood frozen in place, his thumb still hovering over the phone screen. Barron blinked, trying to steady his breathing. He looked up, his eyes wide with the realization that this could be the very thing that set him on a new path, or it could be the thing that destroyed his faith in trying to change anything at all. "I don't know," Barron said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I've just realized something." Richard looked at him, unsure of where this was going. "What's that?" "That sometimes it's not enough to just walk away. Sometimes you can't just throw $1 at something and hope it disappears. I don't think I can do that anymore." But Richard, always the pragmatist, shook his head. "You can't fix everything, Barron. This world doesn't work like that." Barron looked back down at the screen, where the news article still lingered in his hands. He was no longer sure if he could just continue the way he had before. That one moment with John, that brief exchange, had unraveled something deep inside him. There was no going back now. But the question remained, what was he supposed to do with all of this now? Barron's hand trembled as he stared at the screen of his phone. The news article, still flashing before his eyes, felt like an accusation. The image of John, the tired, weathered man with eyes that had seen too much, was burned into his mind. The headlines seemed to mock him. Witnesses reported a youthful encounter with wealthy figure earlier in the day. Wealthy figure. The phrase twisted in Barron's gut. That was how people would always see him, wasn't it? The privileged son of a powerful family. Someone whose life was mapped out for him. Someone who would always be protected, insulated from the reality that John had faced every single day. But now, Barron felt like he had been handed the key to a door he didn't know how to open. What had that encounter really meant? He had given John $1, and that was all. Was that truly all he could offer? Barron felt his stomach churn with guilt. Was he somehow responsible for John's fate? His phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't another news alert. It was a message from his mother. "Barron, I'm at the office. Don't forget about the meeting. We need you there." Her words were matter-of-fact, a stark reminder of the path that had already been laid out for him. She had no idea what Barron was grappling with. No idea that the weight of his life, his choices, and the question of his own purpose had suddenly become unbearable. He stared out of the car window, watching the city pass by in a blur of lights and movement. Richard's voice echoed faintly in his mind. "You can't fix everything, Barron. This world doesn't work like that. But for the first time, Barron wasn't sure he agreed. The car came to a stop in front of the glass and steel tower that housed his family's office, but Barron didn't move. He couldn't. Something inside him had changed, something irreparably broken free. His mother's text, the news article, the encounter with John, it all led him to one inescapable conclusion. He was at a crossroads, and he couldn't walk down the same path anymore. Richard opened the door, but Barron stayed seated, his hands clenched in his lap. "Barron." Richard's voice was concerned now. "We have to go." Barron turned to look at him, the uncertainty in his eyes mirrored by the uncertainty in his heart. "I can't go to the meeting," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "Not right now." Richard's eyebrows furrowed. "What do you mean? You've been preparing for this. Your mother's waiting." "I know," Barron said, his voice quiet but firm. "But something's happened. I can't keep ignoring it. I need to go back to where I saw John." Richard stared at him for a long moment, the silence thick with the unspoken tension of the situation. Barron had always been obedient, always done what was expected of him. But this was different. This was a break from the script. And Richard, ever the professional, wasn't sure how to respond. "What are you going to do?" Richard finally asked, his tone edged with caution. Barron swallowed, trying to steady the storm of thoughts in his mind. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out. I have to." Richard shook his head slightly, clearly unsure. "This isn't the time for this, Barron. You don't even know where he went. He could be gone already." Barron's gaze hardened, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the pull of something deeper than the expectations that had been placed on him. The pull of his own humanity. "Then I'll find him." Before Richard could protest again, Barron opened the door and stepped out of the car. The cold air hit his face like a slap, but it was strangely invigorating. It felt like a moment of clarity, as if every doubt that had plagued him until now was being stripped away, leaving only a single truth. He wasn't going to walk away from this. He didn't know what would come next or how he could possibly make a difference, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let John's story, or his own, be defined by the same tired script he had been living for so long. As Barron walked into the night, the city stretched out before him like a vast, untamed landscape. It was both overwhelming and thrilling. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in his life, Barron felt the stirrings of something he hadn't expected to find: hope. Barron's heart raced as he walked through the darkened streets of Manhattan, the towering buildings around him casting long shadows. He had no clear destination in mind, only the vague memory of the alley where he had last seen John. But with each step, the weight of his decision pressed harder on him. What had he gotten himself into? Could he really find John again? Was it even right to try? As the city buzzed with its usual hum of life, Barron felt more alone than ever. This wasn't the world he knew, the world of board meetings and polished suits, the world where problems could be solved with money or influence. This was real life, raw and unforgiving. And as he rounded the corner of a street, a familiar sight caught his eye: the alley where he had first encountered John. It was eerily quiet now. The once bustling space had emptied, save for the sound of rats skittering in the shadows. Barron hesitated at the entrance. His mind flashed back to that moment earlier, when John had looked at him with such raw vulnerability, challenging Barron to understand something far greater than just $1. He stepped into the alley. The smell of stale garbage mixed with something bitter in the air. Barron moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the ground, the walls, searching for any sign of John. His stomach twisted with anxiety. What if it was too late? What if John had already vanished from this world, just another forgotten soul lost in the shuffle? Just as Barron was about to turn around, he heard a faint noise, a soft, shuffling sound. Barron's breath caught in his throat as he spun toward the source, his eyes widening. There, lying against a crumpled cardboard box, was John. His face was pale, and his breathing was shallow, ragged. Barron's heart hammered in his chest as he rushed to his side, crouching beside him. John's once vibrant eyes were now closed, and his hand was wrapped around the empty cup from earlier, as though he had been clutching it in his final moments. "No," Barron whispered, his voice cracking. "John, no, please." He shook the man gently, but John didn't stir. Barron's mind raced. What could he do? What had he done? It's too late. It's too late to fix this. But then, a faint groan escaped John's lips. Barron exhaled sharply, relief flooding through him, though it was quickly tempered by panic. He needed to act fast. Without thinking, Barron pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services, his fingers shaking as he spoke into the receiver. "I need an ambulance now. There's a man. He's unconscious. He needs help." As he waited, he hovered over John, trying to keep him warm, trying to keep him conscious. The seconds felt like hours. He didn't know if it was too late, if John would even make it. But he couldn't give up now, not after everything. Not after what John had made him see about the world, about his own life, about his own role in all of this. A few minutes later, the distant sound of sirens reached Barron's ears. Relief washed over him like a wave. The paramedics arrived quickly, moving with practiced urgency as they assessed John's condition, hooking him up to oxygen, stabilizing him with efficiency that made Barron's heart tighten. "He's going to be okay," one of the paramedics said, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Barron clung to that reassurance, knowing deep down that this was just the beginning of something far bigger than what he had expected. He had no idea how this would turn out, or what the consequences might be, but for the first time, Barron felt like he had made the right choice. As the paramedics loaded John into the ambulance, Barron stood frozen, watching them go. He could still hear the sirens fading into the distance, the noise of the city once again taking over the space around him. The knot in Barron's chest slowly loosened, but the questions remained. What had he really done here? Was this just a random act of kindness, or had it changed him? He wasn't sure. But what he did know was that, for the first time in a long while, he had made a decision that came from his heart. Not from his family, not from his legacy, but from himself. Barron stood there for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the empty street ahead. He had no answers yet, no clear path forward. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He couldn't keep walking the same way he had before. A week passed, and Barron's life began to shift in ways he hadn't anticipated. John had survived. After being rushed to the hospital, he'd gone through a difficult recovery, but the doctors had been optimistic. Barron never received a thank you, and he didn't expect one. John's journey wasn't over, and neither was his own. Barron returned to the family office, attended his mother's meetings, and engaged in the routine that had once defined him. But each day, he felt the weight of his decision to help John, to step outside the carefully constructed world he'd always known. The encounters with those living on the fringes of society, the ones overlooked by so many, became more than just a passing thought. Barron began to question, what could he really do to make a difference? His mother noticed the change. "You've been distant," she remarked one afternoon. Barron only shrugged, a distant look in his eyes. He had learned that sometimes distance wasn't about escaping, but about making space for something new to emerge. Barron reached out to local shelters and organizations that worked with the homeless, offering his support, not as the son of a billionaire, but as someone who had finally started to see the humanity in those who had been invisible for far too long. He didn't have all the answers, but he no longer believed that money alone could solve the world's deepest problems. Standing at the window of his office, Barron watched the city below, bustling as always. The world felt different now. The weight of the dollar in his hand had given way to a greater understanding. One small act of kindness could change everything.